There is a moment, right before everything changes, where the whole world seems to be moving faster than you. Everyone around you is rushing, chasing, grasping for the next thing before they've even finished the last one. They call it hustle. They call it ambition. They call it staying ahead. But if you look closely, past the noise, past the exhaustion in their eyes, you'll notice something strange. The people running the fastest are rarely the ones who actually get where they're going. They burn out. They break down. They collapse under the weight of their own urgency. And then there are the others, the quiet ones, the ones who move differently, not slower because they're behind, but slower because they understand something the rest of the world has forgotten. Patience is not the absence of ambition. It is the mastery of it. It is the discipline to hold your position while others panic, to wait while others force, to build while others chase shortcuts that were never really there. This is not a video about being passive. This is not a video about sitting back and hoping things work out. This is about a different kind of power. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that doesn't need applause. The kind that compounds quietly in the background while everyone else is busy applauding speed. By the end of this, you will understand why the most patient person in the room is almost always the most dangerous one. Not dangerous in the sense of threat, but dangerous in the sense of capability. Because patience, real patience, strategic patience, is the closest thing to a superpower that exists in a world addicted to instant results. Think about the last time you watched someone stay completely composed while everyone around them was falling apart. There is something almost unsettling about that kind of calm, isn't there? Because, deep down, you know that calm isn't an accident. It's a skill. It was built deliberately through choices most people are never willing to make. Over the next several chapters, we are going to take that skill apart piece by piece. We are going to look at why speed so often fails us. Why the people around you are quietly losing a race they don't even know they're running. Why restraint is one of the most misunderstood forms of power that exists. Why the results you want are built through compounding rather than bursts of effort. And why the quiet, unglamorous discipline behind every victory you've ever admired is the real secret nobody wants to advertise. This is not a video you watch passively and forget by tomorrow. This is a shift in how you see the entire world around you, the people in it, and most importantly, yourself. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Illusion of Speed. We live inside a culture that worships speed. Fast results, fast money, fast transformations. Everywhere you look, someone is promising you the shortcut, the hack, the trick that skips the boring middle part and takes you straight to the reward. And it makes sense why this message spreads so easily. Nobody wants to struggle. Nobody wants to wait. Waiting feels like losing. Every day you're not there yet feels like a day wasted. A day where everyone else is pulling ahead while you're standing still. So people speed up. They rush their decisions. They rush their relationships. They rush their careers, their bodies, their skills, their entire lives. Always chasing the next milestone before they've even absorbed the lessons of the one before it. But here's the part almost nobody wants to admit. Speed is often just another word for avoidance. When you rush through something, you're not mastering it. You're skipping it. You're trading depth for the illusion of progress. And illusions, no matter how convincing, eventually collapse under the weight of reality. Think about the people you've seen flame out, The overnight success that vanished just as quickly as it appeared. The relationship that moved too fast and fell apart before it had real roots. The business that scaled before it had a foundation and crumbled the first time pressure was applied. In almost every case, the problem wasn't lack of talent or lack of opportunity. It was lack of patience. They built on sand because sand is faster to build on than stone. But sand shifts. Stone holds. This is the illusion of speed. It feels like progress because it creates the sensation of movement, the rush of activity, the dopamine hit of doing something instead of nothing. But movement without direction is not progress. It's noise. And the people who understand this, the ones who have trained themselves to resist the pull of instant gratification, they are playing an entirely different game. They are not slower because they lack drive. They are slower because they understand that real strength is built in the parts of the process nobody wants to sit through. The unglamorous repetitions, the quiet mastery, the years where nothing seems to be happening on the surface while everything is happening underneath. Speed gives you the appearance of winning. Patience gives you the actual result. And once you see the difference clearly, you can never unsee it. Every time you feel that urge to rush, to skip, to force an outcome before it's ready, you'll recognize it for what it is. Not ambition. Fear. Fear that if you slow down, you'll fall behind. But the truth almost nobody tells you, is that the people who slow down on purpose are the ones who end up furthest ahead. Consider how this plays out in something as simple as learning a new skill. Someone decides they want to learn to play an instrument, or pick up a new language, or master a craft. In the first week, they are consumed by enthusiasm. They practice for hours. They imagine themselves already fluent, already skilled, already impressive. But by week 3, the excitement has faded and the actual work has begun. The repetitive, unglamorous work of getting slightly better each day without any dramatic breakthrough to show for it. This is exactly where speed-oriented thinking destroys people. They expected the thrill of week 1 to continue indefinitely. And when it doesn't, they interpret the absence of thrill as evidence that they picked the wrong path, the wrong skill, the wrong goal entirely. So they quit. And they move on to the next exciting beginning, chasing that same initial rush over and over again, never sticking around long enough to reach the part where real skill actually starts to form. Meanwhile, someone else, someone who understood from the start that the thrill would fade and the real work would begin, keeps going. Not because they're more talented, not because they have some special reserve of motivation the other person lacks, simply because they expected the slow part, and so they weren't derailed by it. This is the fundamental difference between people who build genuine capability and people who collect a long list of abandoned beginnings. And it extends far beyond hobbies and skills. It shapes entire careers, entire businesses, entire lives. The person who understands that meaningful results take longer than they want them to is the person who is still standing when the ones chasing speed have already burned out and moved on to their next shortcut. Speed convinces you that if something isn't working immediately, it isn't working at all. Patience teaches you the far more accurate lesson that most things worth having simply take longer to build than your impatience wants to admit. There's also a deeper cost to living inside this obsession with speed, one that goes beyond simply failing to achieve your goals. When you're constantly rushing, you never actually experience the process you're rushing through. You're so focused on the destination that the entire journey becomes a blur, something to be endured rather than lived. This means that even when speed does occasionally work, even when someone does manage to force a fast outcome, they often find that the achievement feels hollow because they never developed a real relationship with the work itself. They skip the part where meaning is actually built, the slow accumulation of understanding, connection, and mastery that only comes from staying present with something long enough to truly know it. This is why you sometimes see people achieve exactly what they said they wanted, and yet feel strangely empty once they get there. They optimized for arrival and forgot that the process itself was supposed to be where the value lived all along. Patience protects against this in a way that speed simply cannot. When you allow something to unfold at its natural pace, you're forced to actually be present for it, to notice the small shifts, to build a genuine understanding of what you're doing and why. And this presence, this depth of engagement, is often what separates people who achieve something and immediately need the next thing to feel satisfied from people who achieve something and actually feel the weight and meaning of what they built. Speed might get you to the finish line faster, but it often empties the race of everything that made it worth running in the first place. Patience keeps you connected to the process, and in doing so, it doesn't just produce better outcomes. It produces outcomes you can actually feel proud of because you were present for every part of how they were built. Chapter 2. Why everyone around you is losing. Look around at the people rushing through their lives, jumping from one distraction to the next, one goal to the next, one relationship to the next, always chasing something just out of reach. Most of them are losing, and they don't even know it. Not because they lack ability, not because they lack opportunity. They are losing because they have never learned how to wait. Modern life has trained an entire generation to expect immediate feedback. A message sent gets an instant reply, or it feels like rejection. A goal set has to show results within days, or it feels like failure. A skill practiced for a week that hasn't produced mastery feels like proof that it's not worth continuing. This impatience doesn't just slow people down, it actively sabotages them. It pulls them away from anything that requires sustained effort and pushes them toward anything that offers a quick hit of relief. And so they abandon good decisions the moment those decisions become uncomfortable. They quit jobs the moment they get hard, instead of the moment they stop being worth it. They leave relationships the moment conflict appears, instead of learning how to work through it. They switch strategies the moment results are slow, instead of trusting the process long enough to see it through. This creates a strange kind of chaos, a world full of people who are always starting, but rarely finishing. Always excited, but rarely committed. Always moving, but rarely arriving. And the people who watch this happen, the ones who have learned patience as a skill rather than treating it as a personality trait you either have or don't, they see the pattern immediately. They see the panic underneath the busyness. They see the fear underneath the urgency. And they understand something crucial. The less patient a person is, the more predictable they become. Impatient people are easy to read because their decisions are driven by discomfort rather than strategy. They will always choose the option that relieves pressure fastest, even when it's the wrong option. This is why patient people often seem on the surface, to be moving slower than everyone else, while quietly outperforming them in every meaningful way. They are not reacting to discomfort. They are responding to opportunity. They let others burn their energy on premature moves while they wait for the right moment, the right leverage, the right conditions. This is not weakness. This is precision. And once you start to see the world through this lens, you'll notice something almost unsettling. The people who seem to be losing the most, the ones stuck in cycles of starting over, burning out, and starting again. They are not victims of bad luck. They are victims of their own impatience. And the moment you stop needing everything to happen immediately is the moment you stop being one of them. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from living this way, always chasing, always starting over, always one impulsive decision away from abandoning something that might have actually worked if it had just been given more time. Watch closely, and you'll start to notice the same story playing out across completely different areas of people's lives. The person who jumps from diet to diet, never sticking with any single approach long enough to see whether it actually works, because 2 weeks without dramatic results feels like proof of failure. The person who switches career paths every year or two, always convinced that the next field will finally provide the fulfillment the last one didn't, never staying anywhere long enough to build the depth of expertise that actually creates opportunity. The person who enters relationship after relationship, experiencing the same initial excitement followed by the same eventual disappointment, never recognizing that the pattern isn't about the other person, it's about their own inability to sit with the ordinary, unglamorous stretches that every real relationship inevitably moves through. None of these people are lazy. None of them lack ambition. If anything, they have more ambition than most, constantly reaching for something better. Their failure isn't a failure of desire. It's a failure of endurance. They want the outcome without being willing to endure the process that actually produces it. And this is precisely why impatience is so exhausting to watch from the outside and so exhausting to live from the inside. It keeps a person in a permanent state of always close to something, never quite arriving, always restarting the climb from a slightly different angle, instead of continuing up the same mountain they were already on. The patient person, by contrast, experiences a kind of psychological relief that impatience never allows for. They are not constantly re-evaluating whether they made the right choice. They are not constantly comparing their slow, steady progress to someone else's flashy, temporary one. They have decided. And having decided, they simply continue, trusting that the outcome will arrive on its own timeline, rather than the timeline their anxiety demands. This alone, the simple act of no longer needing instant proof that you're on the right path, is one of the most freeing shifts a person can make, and it is available to absolutely anyone willing to make it. There's also a social dimension to this losing pattern that rarely gets discussed openly. Impatience doesn't just sabotage individual goals, it quietly damages the way people show up for one another. Think about how many friendships fade not because of some dramatic falling out, but because one or both people stopped being willing to put in the slow, unglamorous effort required to maintain a connection over time. Think about how many talented people never reach their potential, not because they lacked ability, but because they surrounded themselves with other impatient people who reinforced the belief that if something isn't working right away, it's time to move on. Impatience spreads. It's contagious in group settings, in workplaces, in families, When enough people around you are chasing quick wins and abandoning anything that requires sustained effort, it becomes exhausting to be the one person still playing the long game, still showing up for something that hasn't paid off yet, still trusting a process everyone else has already given up on. This is part of why patience is sometimes described as a lonely skill. It can genuinely put you out of step with people who have organized their entire lives around immediate gratification. But this is also exactly why it's so powerful. When everyone around you is running the same short, exhausting sprint over and over, restarting from scratch every time results don't come fast enough, the person who simply keeps walking at a steady pace in one consistent direction ends up passing all of them. Not because they were faster, but because they never stopped. This is worth sitting with for a moment. Losing, in this context, doesn't always look like failure. Sometimes it looks like constant motion that never actually goes anywhere. And winning doesn't always look like speed. Sometimes it looks like the quiet, steady person who simply refused to stop. Chapter 3. The hidden power of restraint. There is a kind of strength that never gets celebrated because it doesn't look like strength at all. It looks like stillness. It looks like silence. It looks, to the untrained eye, like doing nothing. This is restraint, and it might be the single most underrated form of power that exists. Everyone admires the person who acts boldly, who speaks up first, who moves fast, and takes risks without hesitation. Almost no one admires the person who holds back, who waits, who chooses not to react even when every instinct is screaming at them to respond immediately. But restraint is not the absence of power. It is power under control. Think about it in terms of physical force. An untrained fighter throws every punch with full force from the very first second, exhausting themselves before the fight has really begun. A trained fighter understands pacing. They hold back. They read their opponent. They wait for the exact moment where their energy will have maximum impact. And then, and only then, do they release it. This is not weakness. This is mastery. The same principle applies to almost every area of life. The person who speaks first in an argument, driven by anger, often says something they regret. The person who waits, who lets the emotion pass before responding, almost always says something more powerful, more precise, more effective. The person who reacts to every provocation gives away their power to whoever is provoking them. The person who restrains themselves keeps their power entirely in their own hands. This is why restraint is so closely tied to patience. Patience is the willingness to wait for the right outcome. Restraint is the discipline to not force that outcome before it's ready. Together, they create a kind of quiet dominance that most people never develop, because it requires something incredibly difficult: tolerating discomfort without acting to relieve it immediately. Most people cannot sit with tension. The moment something feels uncomfortable, whether it's an awkward silence, an unresolved conflict, or an uncertain outcome, they rush to fill it, to fix it, to force resolution just so the discomfort will stop. But the people who master restraint have trained themselves to sit inside that discomfort without flinching. They let silence do the work that words cannot. They let time reveal what impatience would have hidden. They let pressure build in others while remaining calm themselves, because they understand that whoever needs the outcome the least almost always has the most control over it. This is the hidden power of restraint. It doesn't look impressive from the outside. It doesn't get applause. But behind almost every person who seems to have an almost unfair advantage in negotiations, relationships, and high-pressure situations, you will find this same quiet skill. The ability to hold back exactly when everyone else is letting go. Consider what happens in any high-stakes conversation. A negotiation, a difficult conversation with a partner, a tense moment at work. There is almost always a point where the emotional temperature rises, where the urge to respond immediately becomes almost unbearable. Everything in your body tells you to speak, to defend yourself, to fill the silence, to win the moment right now before it slips away. And this is exactly the moment where restraint separates people. The person who gives in to that urge often says something driven purely by the emotional intensity of the moment, something that feels satisfying for a few seconds and costly for a long time afterward. The person who has trained themselves to pause, even for just a few extra seconds, gives their rational mind enough time to catch up with their emotional impulse, and in doing so, almost always finds a better response waiting just behind the first one. This pause is not weakness. It is not indecision. It is one of the most powerful tools a person can develop, because it interrupts the automatic pattern that most people never even question. Most people believe their first reaction is their true reaction, when in reality, the first reaction is almost always the most reactive, the least considered, the most likely to be regretted. The second reaction, the one that arrives after a moment of restraint, is almost always wiser, sharper, and more aligned with what the person actually wants, rather than what their nervous system is demanding in the heat of the moment. This is why so many people who are considered naturally calm under pressure are not, in fact, naturally calm at all. They have simply practiced this pause so many times that it has become automatic, a reflex built through repetition rather than a personality trait they were born with. And once you understand that restraint is a trainable skill rather than a fixed characteristic, everything changes. You stop believing that some people are just naturally more composed than you. You start recognizing that composure, like any other skill, is built through deliberate practice, through choosing, again and again, to hold back exactly when everything in you wants to react. This same principle of restraint extends well beyond conversations and conflict. It shapes how people handle opportunity itself. Picture two investors watching the same volatile market. One sees a sudden dip and panics, selling everything out of fear, reacting to the emotional intensity of the moment rather than the underlying reality of what they're holding. The other sees the same dip and does nothing, not because they're unaware of what's happening, but because they've trained themselves to distinguish between noise and signal, between temporary turbulence and genuine danger. That restraint, that refusal to act, simply because acting feels better than sitting with uncertainty, often turns out to be the single most valuable decision either of them makes that year. The same pattern shows up in career decisions, in business strategy, in almost any situation where pressure builds and a decision has to be made. The untrained instinct is almost always to do something, anything, just to relieve the tension of uncertainty. But the trained instinct, the one built through practiced restraint, understands that doing nothing is often itself a decision, and frequently the correct one. This is deeply counterintuitive in a culture that equates action with competence. We tend to respect people who act decisively and quickly, and we tend to view stillness with suspicion. as though it must be indecision or fear. But there is a profound difference between freezing out of fear and choosing stillness out of strategy. Freezing is passive. It happens to you. Strategic restraint is active. You choose it deliberately because you understand that the value of waiting outweighs the relief of acting. Learning to tell the difference between these two states, between paralysis and patience, is one of the most valuable distinctions a person can develop because it allows you to hold your position with confidence rather than anxiety, knowing that your stillness is a choice rather than a symptom of being overwhelmed. Chapter 4. The compound effect of patience. Nothing that matters happens all at once. Not real strength, not real wealth, not real mastery, not real transformation. Everything that actually lasts is built the same way, through small, consistent actions repeated over a long enough period of time that their effects compound into something extraordinary. This is the part almost everyone understands intellectually, but almost no one lives by, because the early stages of compounding are deceptively unimpressive. In the beginning, patience looks like nothing is happening. You put in the effort. You show up. You do the work. And the results are so small they're almost invisible. This is the exact moment where most people quit, not because they've failed, but because they've misjudged the timeline. They expected linear progress, a steady, visible climb, when in reality growth compounds exponentially, which means the vast majority of the results come at the very end of a long, quiet stretch of effort that produces almost nothing you can see. Think of it like this. If you improved by just 1% every single day after a year, you would not be 36% better. You would be roughly 37 times better, because the improvements build on top of each other, multiplying rather than simply adding. But here is the catch. For most of that year, the difference would be almost impossible to notice day to day. It would only become undeniable in hindsight, once enough time had passed for the compounding to reveal itself. This is why patience is so closely linked to power. The people who understand compounding stop measuring their progress by how much has changed since yesterday. They measure it by staying consistent long enough for the invisible math to catch up with them. They understand that the boring middle section, the part where nothing seems to be happening, is not a sign of failure. It is the exact mechanism by which real transformation is built. Everyone wants the results of compounding. Almost no one wants to survive the unglamorous middle where compounding actually happens. This is why so few people achieve extraordinary outcomes, not because extraordinary outcomes are reserved for the exceptionally talented, but because they are reserved for the exceptionally patient. The ones willing to keep showing up long after the excitement fades, long after the applause stops, long after it stops feeling like progress and starts feeling like routine. Because that routine, sustained long enough, is exactly what separates the people who talk about transformation from the people who actually become transformed. Patience is not just a virtue in this context. It is the literal mechanism through which small efforts become undeniable results. There's a reason this compounding process feels so counterintuitive, and it has to do with how human perception works. We are wired to notice change, not steady states. A dramatic shift grabs our attention immediately. A slow, steady accumulation barely registers at all, even when it's happening right in front of us. This is why someone can walk past a construction site every day for months and barely notice the building rising. Until one day, they look up and suddenly there's a completed structure where there used to be an empty lot. The building didn't appear overnight. It was being built the entire time, brick by brick, in increments too small to notice day to day. But because human perception is tuned to detect sudden change rather than gradual accumulation, it feels sudden even though it wasn't. This is exactly how personal transformation works as well. And understanding this can completely change how you interpret your own lack of visible progress. When you don't see dramatic results after a week or a month or even several months of consistent effort, it doesn't mean nothing is happening. It means the same thing that's happening at that construction site is happening within you, brick by brick, improvement by improvement, in increments too small for your own perception to register in real time. The danger is that most people interpret this lack of visible progress as proof that their efforts aren't working, when in reality, it's simply proof that they haven't yet accumulated enough repetitions for the compounding to become visible. This is precisely why so many people quit right before the moment their effort would have become undeniable. They mistake the quiet, invisible middle of the process for the entire process. And they abandon it right as the exponential curve is about to bend upward. Patience, in this context, isn't just about waiting. It's about trusting a mechanism you cannot directly observe. The same way you trust that a seed planted underground is doing something even though you can't see any of it happening beneath the surface. The people who achieve extraordinary results are not the ones who found some way to skip this invisible middle stretch. They are the ones who trusted it enough to keep showing up through it, long after it stopped feeling exciting and started feeling like nothing more than routine. It's worth pointing out that compounding doesn't just apply to skills and achievements. It applies to character itself. Every time you choose patience over impulsiveness, that choice doesn't disappear once the moment passes. It becomes part of a pattern, and that pattern, repeated enough times, becomes part of who you are. The first time you resist an impulsive decision, it might feel like a small, forgettable moment. But the 100th time, the person making that choice is no longer the same person who started. They have quietly, gradually, become someone who defaults to patience rather than someone who has to fight for it. This is perhaps the most profound form of compounding there is, because it means that every act of patience you practice today is not just working towards some external goal. It's simultaneously reshaping your internal default settings, making the next act of patience slightly easier than the one before it. Over enough time, patience stops being something you have to consciously choose and becomes something closer to your natural state, the same way a river carves a canyon, not through any single dramatic event, but through the same water flowing over the same path for an almost unimaginable length of time. This is why people who have spent years cultivating patience often seem to operate from a place of deep calm that looks almost effortless to those around them. It isn't effortless. It's the visible result of thousands of small, invisible choices compounding into something that finally looks like ease. And this should be enormously encouraging, because it means you don't need to become a patient person overnight. You simply need to start making patient choices today, trusting that each one, however small it feels in the moment, is contributing to a compounding process that will eventually produce a version of you who no longer has to fight for the stillness that once felt so difficult to hold. Chapter 5. The discipline behind every quiet victory. Every victory you've ever admired from a distance, the athlete who dominates their sport, the entrepreneur who built something from nothing, the person who transformed their health, their relationships, their entire life, had a version of themselves at the very beginning who looked nothing like the person you're impressed by now. What you don't see, what almost nobody sees, is the discipline behind the scenes. The thousands of repetitions that happened when no one was watching. The mornings they didn't feel like showing up, but did anyway. The setbacks that would have ended the journey for anyone less committed to seeing it through. This is the part of success that never makes it into the highlight reel. Because discipline isn't dramatic. It isn't exciting. It doesn't make for an inspiring montage. It is quiet, repetitive, and often boring, which is exactly why so few people are willing to embody it consistently. Patience without discipline is just waiting. It's passive. It's hoping things will get better without doing the work required to make them better. But discipline without patience is unsustainable. It burns hot and fast and collapses the moment results don't come quickly enough. Real power comes from the combination of the two. The patience to trust a long timeline, paired with the discipline to keep showing up inside that timeline, day after day, without needing constant proof that it's working. This is what separates people who achieve quiet, lasting victories from people who chase loud, temporary ones. The quiet victories are built by people who have made peace with an uncomfortable truth. Most of the work will go unnoticed for a long time. There will be no applause for the 5th month of consistent effort. There will be no recognition for the version of you that showed up on a day you didn't feel like it. There will be no immediate reward for choosing the harder, slower path over the easier, faster one. And yet, this is exactly where the real strength is built. Not in the moments everyone is watching, but in the countless moments when no one is. The discipline to keep going without external validation is, in many ways, the purest form of patience there is, because it requires you to trust the process, even when the process offers you no proof that it's working. This is the discipline behind every quiet victory you've ever admired. Not talent, not luck, not some rare gift that only a few people are born with, just the willingness to keep showing up, patiently, deliberately, and consistently, long after everyone else has given up and gone looking for a faster way. There's an important distinction worth making here, because discipline is often misunderstood as something harsh, something built on willpower and gritted teeth, and forcing yourself through sheer stubbornness. But the discipline behind lasting achievement rarely looks like that from the inside. It looks more like identity than effort. The people who sustain effort over long periods of time are not constantly battling themselves to keep going. At some point, the behavior stops being something they force themselves to do and becomes something they simply are. The athlete who trains every single day is not, after enough time has passed, engaged in a daily war against the temptation to skip it. Training has become part of who they are, no more optional than brushing their teeth. This shift from forced effort to identity is one of the quiet miracles that patience makes possible. In the beginning, almost everything requires willpower. You have to consciously choose the harder path, again and again, and that choice is often uncomfortable. But if you stay patient long enough, something remarkable happens. The discomfort fades. The behavior becomes automatic. What once required tremendous discipline now requires almost none at all, because it has become woven into your identity rather than remaining a separate task you have to talk yourself into. This is why patient people, over long enough timelines, often appear to have more discipline than everyone around them, when in reality they simply started earlier and stayed consistent long enough for that discipline to become effortless. The impatient person never gets to experience this shift because they abandon the behavior before it has enough time to become automatic. They are perpetually stuck in the hardest phase, the phase that requires the most willpower, because they keep starting over instead of staying the course long enough to reach the phase where it gets easier. Understanding this can change how you approach every difficult habit you're trying to build. The goal is not to rely on willpower forever. The goal is to use patience and consistency to buy yourself enough time for the behavior to become identity, at which point the discipline you once had to force becomes the discipline you simply live. This is also why comparing your beginning to someone else's middle is one of the most destructive habits a person can fall into. When you look at someone who has already reached the point where discipline feels automatic, you're seeing the result of a long, invisible process, not a starting point you failed to match. If you judge your own effortful, uncomfortable early stage against their effortless, established one, you will almost always conclude that something is wrong with you, that you're lacking some quality they clearly have and you clearly don't. But the truth is far simpler and far more encouraging. They didn't start with ease either. They started exactly where you are now, forcing themselves through the same discomfort, fighting the same urges to quit, wondering whether any of it was actually working. The only difference between where you are and where they are is time, patiently endured. This reframing changes everything about how sustainable your own effort can become. Instead of measuring yourself against someone else's finished result, you can measure yourself against your own commitment to staying in the process, trusting that if you simply refuse to quit, you will eventually arrive at the same kind of effortless discipline you currently admire in others. Every person who seems to have quiet, unshakable discipline was once exactly where you are, uncertain, uncomfortable, and unsure whether their effort was building toward anything real. The only thing that separated them from everyone who gave up along the way was their refusal to stop simply because the results hadn't arrived yet. That refusal, repeated daily, is not a talent. It is a decision. And it is a decision available to you in this exact moment, regardless of how many times you've made a different one in the past. Chapter 6. The myth of the overnight success. Every industry has its legends, the stories people tell each other about the person who came out of nowhere and made it big overnight. The unknown artist whose song suddenly went viral. The founder whose company seemed to appear out of thin air and dominate the market within months. The creator whose channel exploded seemingly out of nowhere after years of obscurity. These stories are seductive because they offer an escape from the thing most people don't want to hear. That meaningful success takes time. But if you actually dig into any of these stories, if you go past the headline and into the details, you find something completely different from what the myth suggests. The artist who went viral had been writing songs for a decade before that one finally caught on. The founder whose company appeared out of nowhere had actually failed at 2 previous ventures and spent years quietly building relationships, skills, and knowledge that made the 3rd attempt succeed. The creator whose channel exploded had been posting consistently, sometimes to an audience of a few dozen people, for years before the algorithm or the timing or the culture finally aligned with what they were making. The overnight part of overnight success is almost always a lie. or more accurately, an illusion created by the fact that the public only becomes aware of someone at the exact moment their long, invisible effort finally becomes visible. What looks instant from the outside is, on the inside, the product of years of patient, often thankless work that nobody was paying attention to. This distinction matters enormously, because when people believe in the myth of overnight success, they set themselves up for devastating disappointment. They expect their own effort to produce similarly instant results, and when it doesn't, within weeks or months, they conclude that they must be doing something wrong or that they simply don't have what it takes. In reality, they are exactly where every successful person once stood, in the long, quiet, unglamorous middle, where effort accumulates without any visible reward. The tragedy is that many people quit during this exact stretch. The same stretch that every person they admire also had to pass through, not realizing that the very discomfort they're trying to escape is the same discomfort that preceded every success story they've ever been inspired by. Understanding this changes how you interpret your own lack of instant results. It's not evidence that you're failing. It's evidence that you're in the same position everyone who eventually succeeded was once in, and the only variable left to determine which category you fall into is whether you have the patience to stay there long enough for your own quiet effort to eventually become visible to everyone else. There's a particular kind of clarity that comes from studying these stories closely rather than accepting the polished, condensed version the public usually receives. When you actually trace the timeline of most success stories, you find years, not months. You find failed attempts before the successful one. You find long stretches of doubt, of wondering whether any of it was worth continuing, of watching other people achieve faster, flashier results while quietly persisting with something that hadn't paid off yet. This is the part of the story that never makes it into interviews or documentaries, because it doesn't make for compelling narrative. Nobody wants to watch 3 years of someone showing up, doing unremarkable work, and getting unremarkable results. But those 3 years are not a footnote to the story. They are the story. They are the actual mechanism by which the eventual success became possible. Skip them in the retelling, and you get a myth. Include them, and you get the truth. A truth that is far less exciting but infinitely more useful, because it's the version of the story that actually tells you what to do if you want a similar outcome. It tells you to expect the long stretch. It tells you to expect the doubt. It tells you that watching other people move faster than you is not proof you're on the wrong path. It's simply proof that different paths have different timelines, and yours might require more patience before it bends upward the way theirs did. Every person who has ever achieved something significant has, at some point, looked at their own lack of progress and wondered whether it was ever going to work. The difference between the ones who eventually succeeded and the ones who quietly gave up isn't that the successful ones never doubted themselves. It's that they kept moving despite the doubt, trusting a timeline they couldn't see the end of, because they understood, even if only instinctively, that the myth of overnight success was exactly that, a myth, and that the real path forward required exactly the kind of patience most people are never willing to give it. There's also something worth saying about how the myth of overnight success actively distorts the way people evaluate their own decisions. When someone believes success should arrive quickly, every month that passes without a breakthrough starts to feel like evidence of a wrong turn. And this belief can drive people to abandon perfectly good strategies simply because they haven't yet had enough time to work. Imagine someone learning a skill using an effective, well-structured approach, one that would genuinely produce mastery if given enough time. If that person expects results within a few weeks, and those results don't arrive because the timeline was always going to be longer than that, they may conclude the entire approach was flawed. They switch strategies, start over with something new, and repeat the same pattern, never actually giving any single approach enough time to prove itself, all because their expectations were calibrated to a myth rather than reality. This is one of the most subtle but devastating consequences of overnight success thinking. It doesn't just create disappointment, it actively causes people to sabotage effective strategies by abandoning them too early, chasing the next promising shortcut instead of trusting the one they're already on. The antidote isn't blind persistence with a strategy that genuinely isn't working. It's recalibrating your expectations to match reality. Understanding from the outset that meaningful results typically take far longer than your instincts want to believe, so that when the early months pass without dramatic breakthroughs, you interpret this correctly as the normal, expected shape of real progress, rather than incorrectly as proof that something has gone wrong. Once you internalize this, something shifts in how you approach new goals entirely. You stop asking how quickly you can achieve something and start asking what a realistic, honest timeline actually looks like, given the nature of what you're trying to build. This single question, asked honestly rather than optimistically, can save years of wasted effort spent bouncing between strategies that were never given a fair chance to work. It allows you to commit fully to an approach, not out of stubbornness, but out of a clear-eyed understanding that the approach was never going to show dramatic results in the first few weeks anyway, so the absence of those results changes nothing about whether you should continue. This is the quiet, practical power of dismantling the overnight success myth. It doesn't just protect you from disappointment, it protects your strategies themselves, allowing you to give them the actual time they need to prove whether they work, rather than abandoning them prematurely based on expectations that were never realistic in the first place. Chapter 7. Emotional Mastery Under Pressure. Pressure reveals people. It's easy to appear calm, composed, and disciplined when everything is going smoothly. When there's no urgency, no threat, no uncertainty forcing your hand. The real test of a person's character, their patience, their strength, arrives the moment things start to go wrong, the moment stakes rise and outcomes become uncertain. This is where most people's composure collapses, and it's worth understanding exactly why. When pressure builds, the human brain shifts into a state optimized for immediate survival rather than long-term thinking. Blood flow moves away from the areas responsible for careful reasoning and toward the areas responsible for fast, instinctive reaction. This is an ancient system built for a world of immediate physical threats, and it doesn't distinguish particularly well between a genuine emergency and a stressful email, a tense conversation, or a market downturn. The result is that under pressure, most people's decision-making quality drops dramatically, right at the exact moment when good decision-making matters most. They react instead of respond. They choose the option that relieves the discomfort of uncertainty fastest rather than the option that actually serves their long-term interests. This is why so many costly mistakes happen, not because people lack intelligence or knowledge, but because pressure hijacks their ability to access that intelligence and knowledge in the moment it's needed most. Emotional mastery under pressure is not about suppressing this response entirely, which is neither possible nor healthy. It's about creating enough space between the initial reaction and the eventual action that your more considered thinking has time to catch up. This space is where patience does its most valuable work. The person who has trained themselves to pause under pressure, even briefly, gives their rational mind a chance to override the panic response that would otherwise dictate their behavior. This pause might only last a few seconds, but those few seconds are often the difference between a decision driven by fear and a decision driven by strategy. What makes this especially powerful is that emotional mastery under pressure is not an innate trait some people are simply born with while others are not. It's a skill built through repeated exposure to pressure combined with deliberate practice at responding to it differently than instinct demands. Every time you face a stressful situation and choose to pause rather than react immediately, you are training this skill, strengthening the neural pathways that allow you to access calm, considered thinking even when your nervous system is screaming at you to do otherwise. This is precisely why people who have weathered significant hardship often display a kind of unshakable calm that others find almost mysterious. They aren't naturally different from everyone else. They have simply had more opportunities to practice choosing patience over panic. And each time they made that choice, it became slightly easier to make again. Conversely, people who have avoided pressure and difficulty throughout their lives often struggle the most when it finally arrives, not because they're weaker, but because they never had the chance to build this particular muscle. This has a profound implication for how you should think about the difficult moments in your own life. Every high-pressure situation you face is not simply an obstacle to survive, it's an opportunity to practice exactly the kind of emotional mastery that will make you stronger for the next one. The goal isn't to eliminate pressure from your life, which is neither realistic nor even desirable, since pressure is often what forces growth in the first place. The goal is to change your relationship with it, to stop viewing it as something that happens to you, and start viewing it as something you can respond to deliberately, patiently, and with a clarity that most people never develop simply because they never chose to build it. It helps to understand what's actually happening physiologically during moments of intense pressure, because this knowledge itself becomes a tool for building patience under stress. When the body perceives a threat, real or imagined, it releases a cascade of stress hormones designed to prepare you for immediate physical action. To fight or to flee, heart rate increases. Breathing becomes shallow and rapid. Muscles tense. This response happens almost instantaneously, faster than conscious thought, which is precisely why it can feel impossible to control in the moment. But here's the crucial insight. This physiological state, while intense, is also temporary. If you simply wait it out, without acting on the urgency it creates, the intensity naturally begins to subside within a matter of minutes. This is why one of the most powerful tools for emotional mastery under pressure is deceptively simple: delaying any major decision or reaction until this initial physiological wave has passed. Not because the feeling isn't real, but because decisions made while your body is flooded with stress hormones are rarely your best decisions. They're your fastest decisions, which is a very different thing. People who understand this build in deliberate delay as a standard practice, a rule they apply to themselves regardless of how urgent a situation feels in the moment. They've learned, through experience, that almost nothing is actually as urgent as their nervous system insists it is, and that giving themselves even a small amount of time before responding transforms the quality of their decision-making dramatically. This single habit, waiting out the physiological spike before acting, might be one of the most practical, immediately applicable expressions of patience that exists, because it doesn't require years of practice to implement. Only the willingness to trust that your calmer self, given a few minutes, will make a better choice than your panicked self is capable of making right now. There's a further layer to this worth understanding, which is how repeated practice at this delay eventually changes the intensity of the initial reaction itself. In the beginning, waiting out the physiological spike can feel almost unbearable, like holding your breath underwater while every instinct screams at you to surface immediately. But with enough repetition, something remarkable happens. The spike itself becomes smaller. Your nervous system, having learned through direct experience that the threat was rarely as severe as it initially felt, begins calibrating its response more accurately, reacting with less intensity to situations that don't actually warrant the full emergency response. This is why people who have spent years deliberately practicing patience under pressure often report that difficult situations simply don't feel as overwhelming as they once did. It's not that they've become numb or indifferent. It's that their entire nervous system has been recalibrated through repeated, patient exposure to pressure, becoming more accurate in distinguishing real emergencies from ordinary difficulty. This recalibration is one of the most valuable long-term benefits of practicing emotional patience, because it doesn't just help you handle the difficulty in front of you right now, it fundamentally changes how intensely you experience difficulty going forward, making every future challenge slightly more manageable than it would have been otherwise. Chapter 8. The Long Game Advantage. There is a specific kind of advantage that only becomes available to people willing to think in longer time frames than everyone around them. And once you understand how it works, you start to see it everywhere. Most people, most competitors, most decision-makers in any field are operating on relatively short timelines, optimizing for results within weeks or months rather than years or decades. This isn't necessarily a character flaw. It's often simply a byproduct of pressure, whether financial, social, or psychological, that pushes people toward whatever produces the fastest visible result. But this widespread, short-term thinking creates an enormous opportunity for anyone willing to operate differently. When almost everyone else is optimizing for the next quarter, the next month, the next immediate win, the person who is willing to sacrifice short-term gains for long-term positioning gains access to strategies, relationships, and opportunities that are simply unavailable to anyone operating on a shorter timeline. Consider how this plays out in relationships and networks. Someone who approaches every interaction looking for immediate value, immediate reciprocity, immediate benefit, tends to build shallow, transactional connections that dissolve the moment the immediate benefit disappears. Someone who approaches relationships with a long-term mindset, investing in people without demanding immediate return, often builds a network of far greater depth and value over time, precisely because they were patient enough to let those relationships develop naturally, rather than forcing premature extraction of value from them. The same principle applies to skill development, business strategy, financial decisions, and virtually every domain where compounding effects exist. The long game advantage isn't about being smarter or more talented than people optimizing for short-term results. It's about being willing to accept short-term costs, slower visible progress, delayed gratification, in exchange for a much larger payoff further down the timeline. This willingness is rare precisely because it requires tolerating a kind of discomfort that most people instinctively avoid. The discomfort of watching others get ahead of you in the short term, while you continue investing in something that hasn't paid off yet. What makes the long game advantage particularly powerful is that it tends to compound not just in results, but in reduced competition. As time horizons extend, fewer and fewer people are willing to stay in the game. This means that the further out you're willing to think, the less crowded that particular space becomes. Everyone wants the results available at the 10-year mark, but very few people are willing to actually commit to 10 years of patient, consistent effort to get there. This creates a strange inversion where the longest timelines, the ones that require the most patience, often produce the least competition and therefore the greatest opportunity, precisely because most people have already been filtered out by their own impatience long before that timeline arrives. This is why so many of the most significant achievements in any field belong to people who simply refuse to abandon a long-term vision, even when the short-term evidence seemed to suggest they were wasting their time. They understood something that impatient people rarely grasp: that the value of patience isn't just in what it eventually produces, it's in how it thins the field of competition, leaving the largest rewards for the smallest group of people still standing at the end. If you're willing to think in years while everyone around you is thinking in weeks, you're not just playing the same game slower, you're playing an entirely different game, one with dramatically better odds, precisely because so few people are willing to enter it in the first place. This dynamic also explains why so much genuine innovation and lasting achievement tends to come from people who were, for a significant stretch of time, operating well outside of any spotlight, without the pressure of immediate public evaluation, without needing to prove quarterly or even yearly results to an impatient audience. They were free to make decisions based purely on long-term soundness rather than short-term optics. This freedom is one of the hidden advantages of patience that rarely gets discussed. When you're not desperately trying to prove something within an unreasonably short time frame, you can make better decisions. Decisions less distorted by the anxiety of needing to look successful right now. You can walk away from a tempting but ultimately weak opportunity because you're not desperate for an immediate win. You can invest in foundational work that won't pay off for years, because you're not measuring your worth by what you've produced this month. You can say no to shortcuts that would create the appearance of progress while quietly undermining the substance of what you're actually building. All of this becomes possible specifically because patience removes the desperation that so often drives people toward decisions they'll later regret. Desperation is, in many ways, the enemy of good long-term strategy, because desperate decisions are almost always optimized for relieving immediate discomfort rather than building lasting value. Patience is the antidote to desperation. It creates enough psychological space between you and any single outcome that you're able to make clear, strategic choices rather than anxious, reactive ones. This is perhaps the deepest layer of the long game advantage. It's not just about accumulating better results over a longer timeline. It's about the quality of thinking that becomes available to you the moment you stop needing everything to work out immediately. It's worth noting, too, that adopting a long-game mindset doesn't mean abandoning urgency altogether, or drifting through life without any sense of forward momentum. It means directing that urgency toward the right target. Instead of urgently chasing whatever produces the fastest visible result, the long-game thinker urgently protects their consistency, urgently guards their foundational habits, urgently refuses to let short-term setbacks derail a strategy built for the long haul. This is a completely different application of urgency than most people are used to. One focused on process rather than outcome. And this shift from outcome urgency to process urgency might be one of the most useful reframes available to anyone trying to build patience without losing their drive. You don't have to choose between ambition and patience. You simply have to redirect your ambition towards staying consistent over a long enough period of time for that consistency to produce the outcome you're after, rather than aiming your ambition directly at the outcome itself and becoming increasingly frustrated every time it doesn't arrive as quickly as you'd like. Chapter 9. How Patience Builds Unshakable Confidence. Confidence is often misunderstood as something you either have or don't have. Some fixed quality baked into a person's personality from birth. But real, durable confidence, the kind that doesn't collapse the moment things get difficult, is built through a very specific process, and patience sits right at the center of it. Consider where fragile confidence comes from. It often comes from external validation, praise, quick wins, comparisons that happen to favor you in the moment. This kind of confidence feels good while it lasts, but it's entirely dependent on circumstances outside your control. The moment the praise stops, the moment the comparisons shift, the moment the winds slow down, this fragile confidence collapses just as quickly as it appeared, because it was never actually built on anything solid. It was borrowed from external conditions rather than earned through internal proof. Durable confidence works completely differently, and it can only be built through one mechanism: accumulated evidence that you can handle difficulty over time. Every time you face a hard situation and stay patient through it, rather than panicking or quitting, you're not just solving that particular problem. You're gathering evidence about yourself, evidence that becomes part of your internal record of who you are and what you're capable of enduring. This evidence compounds exactly the way skills and results compound, quietly, invisibly, until eventually you have such a substantial track record of staying steady through difficulty that new difficulties stop feeling as threatening. Your nervous system, drawing on that accumulated evidence, responds to new challenges not with the same intensity of fear it once did, because it has learned, through repeated direct experience, that you are someone who handles hard things and comes out the other side. This is why people who have weathered genuine hardship, who have patiently endured long stretches of difficulty without collapsing, so often display a kind of quiet confidence that people who have avoided hardship simply don't have access to, no matter how naturally talented or intelligent they might be. It's not that hardship itself builds confidence. Plenty of people go through difficulty and come out more anxious rather than more confident. The difference lies specifically in how that difficulty was handled. If it was handled with patience, with a willingness to stay steady rather than panic, the difficulty becomes proof of capability. If it was handled with panic and avoidance, the same difficulty can become proof of fragility instead. This means that confidence isn't really built by avoiding hard things, which is what most people instinctively try to do. It's built by facing hard things patiently, again and again, until your track record of doing so becomes undeniable even to your own inner critic. This has an important implication for anyone who feels they currently lack confidence. The solution isn't to wait until you feel confident before taking on difficulty. The solution is to take on difficulty patiently now, and let the confidence arrive afterward, as a natural byproduct of having proven to yourself that you can handle it. Confidence built this way through patient, repeated exposure to difficulty, rather than avoidance of it, becomes remarkably stable because it isn't dependent on anyone else's opinion or any particular set of favorable circumstances. It's built on something far more solid: your own direct, accumulated experience of staying patient through hard things and coming out stronger on the other side. This also explains why confidence built through patience tends to be remarkably specific and grounded, rather than vague and easily shaken. A person whose confidence comes from patiently working through real difficulty doesn't just believe, in some abstract sense, that they're capable. They have a detailed internal catalog of exactly what they've endured and how they handled it. They remember the specific project that seemed impossible and the specific way they broke it down and worked through it patiently over months. They remember the specific relationship difficulty that felt unresolvable and the specific way staying calm and consistent eventually turned things around. This specificity matters enormously because vague confidence, the kind built on general encouragement or borrowed belief, tends to evaporate the moment a new, unfamiliar challenge appears, precisely because it was never tested against anything concrete. Specific, evidence-based confidence doesn't evaporate the same way, because even when a new challenge looks unfamiliar on the surface, the underlying pattern, staying patient and steady through difficulty, is one you've already proven to yourself you're capable of, over and over again, in situations that felt just as uncertain at the time. This is why patient people often display a kind of confidence that seems almost unreasonable to outside observers. A willingness to face new, intimidating challenges without the usual paralysis that uncertainty tends to produce in others. It isn't recklessness. It's the natural result of having built, patiently and deliberately, an internal track record substantial enough that new uncertainty no longer feels as threatening as it once did. Every difficult situation you move through with patience rather than panic adds one more entry to that track record. And over enough time, that accumulated evidence becomes the single most reliable source of confidence a person can ever build. Because, unlike external validation, it can never be taken away from you. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it reframes the entire relationship between confidence and difficulty. Most people wait to feel confident before they're willing to attempt something hard, assuming confidence is a prerequisite rather than a byproduct. But if confidence can only be built through patiently handled difficulty, then waiting for confidence before acting creates an impossible loop, one where the very thing you need to feel ready for the challenge can only be generated by facing the challenge in the first place. Breaking this loop requires a willingness to act before you feel ready, to face difficulty patiently even while doubt is still present, trusting that the confidence will follow the action rather than precede it. This is uncomfortable because it means accepting that you may need to feel uncertain, even afraid, while still choosing to move forward patiently anyway. But this discomfort is exactly where durable confidence gets built. Every person you've ever admired for their apparent fearlessness once stood exactly where you're standing now, uncertain and unconvinced of their own capability, and the only reason they eventually developed the confidence you now see is that they were willing to act patiently through that uncertainty, long enough for the evidence to accumulate. Chapter 10. The cost of chasing everyone else's timeline. One of the quietest but most damaging habits a person can fall into is measuring their own progress against a timeline that was never actually theirs to begin with. Social comparison has always existed, but the constant visibility of other people's highlight reels has turned it into something far more corrosive than it used to be. You see someone your age, who seems to have already achieved what you're still working toward, and immediately a kind of internal panic sets in. You should be further along by now. You're falling behind. Something must be wrong with you or your approach. This reaction feels urgent and important in the moment, but it's built on a fundamentally flawed premise. The idea that everyone is supposed to be moving through life on the same schedule, reaching the same milestones at the same pace, as though there's a universal timeline everyone is secretly being measured against. There isn't. Every person's path involves a different starting point, different resources, different obstacles, different luck, and different timing. Comparing your chapter to someone else's chapter without knowing the full length or shape of either book produces nothing but distorted, misleading conclusions. And yet, this comparison is exactly what drives so many people to abandon patient, steady progress in favor of rushed, anxious decision-making. They see someone else moving faster and interpret it as evidence that their own pace is wrong, so they speed up, cutting corners, skipping steps, forcing outcomes before they're ready, all in an attempt to catch up to a timeline that was never actually relevant to their own situation in the first place. This is one of the most common ways patience gets sacrificed, not because a person lacks the capacity for it, but because external comparison convinces them that patience is a luxury they can no longer afford. The cost of this pattern is significant and often invisible until much later. When you chase someone else's timeline, you make decisions optimized for catching up, rather than decisions optimized for building something solid. You take shortcuts that weaken the foundation of whatever you're building, all in service of appearing to be at the same stage as someone whose actual circumstances you don't fully understand. And even in the rare cases where this rushed approach produces some form of quick result, that result is often unstable, built on a foundation that wasn't given the time it needed to properly set. Meanwhile, the person who resists this comparison, who commits to their own pace regardless of how it looks next to someone else's, ends up building something far more durable precisely because they weren't sacrificing quality for speed. This doesn't mean ambition or urgency are bad. It means the urgency needs to come from your own genuine goals and values, not from anxious comparison to someone else's unrelated journey. Learning to disconnect your sense of progress from other people's timelines is one of the most liberating shifts a person can make, because it removes an enormous, unnecessary source of pressure that was never actually serving you in the first place. Your path was never supposed to look like anyone else's. The moment you stop measuring your patience against someone else's speed is the moment you finally give yourself permission to build something real, at the pace it actually requires, rather than the pace anxiety convinces you that you need. It's also worth acknowledging how much this comparison is amplified by the specific way information reaches us now. What you see of other people's progress is almost never the full picture. You see the launch, not the 18 months of quiet preparation before it. You see the milestone, not the string of failures that preceded it. You see the confident announcement, not the private uncertainty the person felt right up until the moment they made it public. This selective visibility creates a deeply distorted impression, one where everyone else appears to be moving in a straight, fast line towards success, while you experience your own path in its full, messy, non-linear reality, complete with every doubt, delay, and setback that never gets shown in anyone else's version of events. Comparing your full, unfiltered experience to someone else's carefully curated highlight reel is not a fair comparison. And yet, it's the comparison almost everyone makes, usually without even realizing they're doing it. Recognizing this distortion is one of the most practical steps toward reclaiming your own patience. Every time you catch yourself feeling behind because of something you saw, it's worth pausing to remember that you're almost certainly comparing your entire process to someone else's edited outcome. If you could see their full, unfiltered timeline, the actual months and years behind whatever moment you're reacting to, it would almost certainly look far more similar to your own uncertain, non-linear path than the polished version ever suggested. This doesn't mean you should stop paying attention to what others are doing entirely. There's real value in learning from people ahead of you. But it does mean holding that information loosely, using it for inspiration or insight rather than as evidence for judging whether your own pace is acceptable. Your timeline was never something to be measured against anyone else's. It was always simply the amount of time your particular path actually required. And the sooner you make peace with that, the sooner you can stop wasting energy on comparison and redirect all of it toward the patient, steady work that will actually move you forward. There's a final piece to this worth naming clearly, because it ties directly back to everything covered so far. Chasing someone else's timeline is, at its core, another expression of the same impatience explored from the very beginning of this video. The same discomfort with uncertainty, the same difficulty trusting a process you can't fully see the end of. Every chapter you've encountered so far, the illusion of speed, the pattern of losing through impatience, the power of restraint, the mechanics of compounding, the discipline behind quiet victories, the myth of overnight success, emotional mastery under pressure, the long game advantage, and the confidence built through patient endurance. All of it converges on this same central truth. Patience is not a single skill you either possess or lack. It's a way of relating to time itself, a willingness to trust processes that unfold slower than your anxiety would prefer, and a refusal to sacrifice long-term substance for short-term relief. Everything explored up to this point has been building toward showing you exactly why that trust is so well placed, and exactly what becomes possible once you're willing to extend it toward your own path, on your own timeline. Regardless of how fast or slow anyone else around you happens to be moving. Chapter 11. The Patience of Masters. Every field, no matter how different they appear on the surface, shares a hidden structure that most people never fully understand until they've spent years inside it. This structure is the plateau, the long, flat stretch where effort continues but visible improvement seems to stop entirely. Beginners rarely encounter this, because beginners improve quickly, almost automatically, simply by showing up and doing the basics. This early, rapid improvement creates a dangerous expectation, the belief that progress should always feel this fast, this rewarding, this visible. But then, inevitably, the plateau arrives. The improvements slow. The gains that once came weekly now seem to take months. And for most people, this is where the journey quietly ends. Not through dramatic failure, but through a gradual loss of motivation, as the plateau stretches longer than they expected it to. What separates true masters from everyone who stopped along the way is not that they never experienced the plateau. Every master has spent enormous stretches of time there, often far longer than anyone watching from the outside would ever guess. What separates them is how they related to that plateau. Instead of interpreting it as evidence that they had reached their limit or that progress had stopped, they understood it as an inherent, unavoidable part of the process, one that had to be patiently endured rather than escaped. This understanding changes everything about how a person experiences the plateau. Without it, every flat stretch feels like failure, like proof that something is wrong. With it, the same flat stretch becomes simply the expected texture of deep skill development. Uncomfortable, yes, but not alarming. Not a sign to quit, just a phase to move through with steady, patient effort until the next breakthrough eventually arrives. What makes the plateau particularly deceptive is that meaningful development is often still happening beneath the surface, even when no visible improvement is showing up. Skill acquisition research consistently shows that the brain continues restructuring itself during periods that feel stagnant, consolidating what's already been learned, strengthening the underlying neural architecture that will eventually support the next visible leap forward. In other words, the plateau isn't actually empty time. It's preparation time. Invisible groundwork being laid for a breakthrough that hasn't happened yet, but is being made possible by exactly the kind of patient, continued practice that feels, in the moment, like it's accomplishing nothing at all. Masters understand this. Sometimes explicitly, sometimes only through hard-won intuition, built from having lived through the pattern many times before. They've learned to trust the plateau rather than fear it, to interpret the absence of visible progress as a normal, necessary phase, rather than a verdict on their ability or their chosen path. This trust is itself a form of patience, arguably one of the most difficult forms, because it requires continuing to invest effort into something that offers you no immediate proof that the investment is working. And yet this exact willingness to keep training through the plateau without demanding constant reassurance that it's paying off is precisely what eventually produces mastery. The people who never make it past the intermediate stage in any field are rarely the ones who lacked talent. They are, overwhelmingly, the ones who encountered the plateau and, lacking the patience to trust it, walked away right before the breakthrough they were quietly building toward. There's another dimension to the patience of masters that deserves attention, which is how their relationship to feedback and correction changes over time. Beginners often experience feedback as a verdict on their worth, something to be either celebrated or dreaded, depending on whether it's positive or negative. Masters relate to feedback completely differently, treating even harsh, critical feedback as simply useful information to be patiently incorporated, rather than a judgment to be emotionally absorbed. This shift doesn't happen because masters care less about their work. Quite the opposite. It happens because they've spent enough time patiently refining their craft to understand that improvement is a never-ending process, one where today's correction is simply tomorrow's foundation. This patience with feedback allows masters to improve at a rate that would be impossible for someone still treating every critique as a threat to their identity. They can sit with criticism, extract what's useful from it, discard what isn't, and continue forward without the emotional turbulence that derails so many people earlier in their development. This is worth remembering the next time you receive feedback that stings. The sting itself is not the problem. The problem is treating that sting as a reason to retreat rather than as simply one more piece of information to patiently work through on your way to eventually mastering whatever it is you're building. Masters were not born with thicker skin. They built it patiently, feedback by feedback, over years of choosing to stay in the process rather than let any single piece of criticism convince them to abandon it. There's one more quality worth naming among those who reach true mastery, and it's how they come to relate to the very idea of an ending point. Beginners often imagine mastery as a destination, a fixed level of skill they will eventually reach and then simply maintain. Masters almost universally describe the experience differently. The closer they get to what once looked like the top, the more clearly they can see how much further the path actually extends. This might sound discouraging, but in practice, it produces the opposite effect. It removes the pressure of ever needing to arrive at some final, complete state and replaces it with a sustainable, ongoing relationship to growth itself. This is one of the quiet gifts patience gives to anyone who practices it long enough to reach genuine skill. The goal stops being some distant finish line and becomes the process itself, the daily, patient engagement with getting slightly better, which turns out to be far more sustainable and far more satisfying than chasing a finish line that keeps receding the closer you get to it anyway. There's also a quiet camaraderie that tends to form among people who have patiently endured the plateau together, whether they realize it or not. Anyone who has spent real time in a demanding craft can usually recognize this quality in another person almost instantly. A kind of settled, unhurried focus that only comes from having personally survived the long stretches where progress refused to show itself. This recognition often forms deeper professional respect than any credential or achievement could on its own, because it signals something credentials cannot fully capture: the demonstrated willingness to keep showing up through discouragement. This is worth remembering whenever you find yourself deep inside your own plateau, wondering whether anyone notices the effort you're patiently putting in even though the results haven't caught up yet. Someone who has walked a similar road almost certainly does notice, even if they never say so directly, because they recognize in you the exact quality that once carried them through their own quiet, unglamorous stretch of patient, invisible work. Chapter 12. The strength in not explaining yourself. There is a specific kind of pressure that builds inside social situations. The pressure to explain, to justify, to defend every decision the moment someone questions it. Most people feel almost compelled to respond to this pressure immediately, offering reasons, context, and justifications the second their choices are challenged, as though silence in the face of a question would somehow be interpreted as guilt or uncertainty. But there is a different, quieter kind of strength available to anyone willing to resist this compulsion, the strength of allowing your actions to speak without constant narration, the strength of trusting your own decisions enough that you don't need external agreement to feel settled in them. This is not the same as being closed off or refusing to communicate. It is something far more specific. The discipline to not feel obligated to defend every choice to every person who happens to question it, especially in moments where that questioning is driven more by the other person's discomfort than by any genuine need for clarity. When you rush to explain yourself the instant someone raises an eyebrow, you are, often without realizing it, handing them a kind of authority over your decisions, treating their skepticism as something that requires immediate resolution. Patience interrupts this pattern. It allows you to sit inside someone else's doubt, without needing to immediately dissolve it, trusting that time, results, and your own continued consistency will do far more convincing than any explanation could in the moment. This becomes especially important in the early, uncertain stages of pursuing something meaningful, precisely the stages where outside doubt tends to be loudest and your own results are least visible yet. If you feel compelled to defend an unfinished project, an unproven strategy, or an unconventional decision, every time someone questions it, you end up spending enormous amounts of energy managing other people's skepticism, instead of channeling that energy into the actual work that will eventually make the skepticism irrelevant. Patient people learn, often through hard experience, that most doubt directed at them during these early stages isn't actually asking for information. It's expressing the doubter's own discomfort with uncertainty, projected outward. Trying to resolve that discomfort through explanation is usually a losing game, because the doubt was never really about the specific details you're offering. It was about an underlying discomfort with watching someone commit to something unproven. The only thing that actually resolves this kind of doubt is time and results, not argument. This is why some of the most effective people in any field develop a kind of quiet immunity to needing external validation for their choices. They've learned that their energy is better spent on patient, consistent execution than on convincing every skeptic along the way. And they've learned that the people who doubted them early on are almost always converted. Eventually, not by anything they said, but by simply watching the results speak for themselves over enough time. Restraint from constant self-justification is not arrogance. It's an extremely efficient allocation of energy, one that protects your patience from being drained by arguments that were never actually going to be resolved through argument in the first place. It's worth distinguishing this from stubbornness or an unwillingness to grow, because the two are easy to confuse. If you're not careful, there is a real difference between refusing to explain yourself because you're avoiding accountability and choosing not to explain yourself because you recognize the specific questioning you're facing isn't actually seeking understanding. It's seeking reassurance for the questioner's own discomfort. The first is a form of avoidance that ultimately weakens your relationships and your own growth. The second is a form of discernment that protects your energy for the work that actually matters. Learning to tell these apart requires honest self-reflection, because it's tempting to hide behind the second explanation, even when the first is closer to the truth. But when the distinction is applied honestly, it becomes an extraordinarily useful filter. Ask yourself, when someone questions a decision you've made, whether they're genuinely trying to understand something that would help them support you better, or whether they're simply expressing discomfort with uncertainty and looking for you to resolve that discomfort on their behalf. The first deserves patient, thoughtful explanation. The second deserves patient, quiet confidence that doesn't require their approval to remain steady. Mastering this distinction is itself an exercise in patience, because it requires resisting the immediate urge to over-explain simply to make an uncomfortable moment of questioning pass more quickly, and instead sitting with that discomfort long enough to determine what kind of response the situation actually calls for. There's a broader principle underneath all of this, worth naming directly, which is that your energy is finite, and every moment spent managing other people's doubt is a moment not spent building the thing that would actually resolve that doubt permanently. This trade-off is easy to overlook in the moment because defending yourself feels productive. It feels like you're addressing the problem. But in reality, most doubt directed at unproven work or unconventional decisions cannot be talked away. It can only be outlasted. The patient response, choosing to redirect that defensive energy back into the work itself, is almost always more effective than the reactive response, no matter how unsatisfying it feels to let a skeptical comment go unanswered in the moment. This requires a kind of long-term thinking that runs directly counter to the short-term relief that comes from winning an argument or successfully defending a decision in real time. But the people who master this trade-off, who learn to consistently choose patient silence over reactive justification, end up with far more energy available for the work that actually changes minds, which, as it turns out, was never the explanation in the first place. It was always the result. There's one more consideration worth raising here, which is how this quiet confidence affects the people around you over time. Even those who were initially skeptical, watching someone stay calm and consistent in the face of doubt, without becoming defensive or desperate for validation, tends to have a strange effect on observers. It often earns more respect than any explanation could have, precisely because it demonstrates a level of internal security that words alone rarely convey. People are drawn to steadiness, even when they don't consciously recognize why. This means that the discipline of not explaining yourself unnecessarily doesn't just conserve your own energy. It can actively strengthen how others perceive you over time, transforming former skeptics into quiet admirers. Not through anything you said in your own defense, but simply through the consistent, patient example of someone who trusted their own path enough to keep walking it without needing anyone else's permission along the way. Chapter 13. Patience as the foundation of real connection. Nowhere does impatience cause more quiet, lasting damage than in how people relate to one another. Modern life has conditioned people to expect instant compatibility, instant chemistry, instant resolution to any friction that appears in a relationship, whether romantic, familial, or platonic. And when that instant ease doesn't materialize, when a relationship requires effort, requires working through misunderstanding, requires sitting with discomfort long enough to actually understand another person rather than simply reacting to the first impression they give, many people interpret this difficulty as proof that the relationship itself is flawed. But real connection has never worked this way, and it never will. Genuine understanding between two people is not something that arrives instantly, no matter how strong the initial spark might feel. It's something built gradually, through repeated interactions, through the patient accumulation of small moments that slowly construct a real, accurate picture of who someone actually is beneath their first impression. People who rush this process, who expect deep understanding to arrive within the first few conversations, end up either forcing false intimacy that collapses under its own weight later, or abandoning potentially meaningful relationships simply because they didn't feel effortless from the very beginning. Patience, in this context, is not passive waiting. It's the active discipline of continuing to show up, to communicate, to work through friction, even when doing so requires more effort than the initial excitement suggested it would. This patience becomes especially critical during the inevitable moments of conflict that arise in any relationship worth having. Impatient people tend to treat conflict as an emergency, something that must be resolved immediately, often through whatever response relieves their own discomfort fastest, regardless of whether that response actually serves the relationship. This is precisely why so many arguments escalate unnecessarily, not because the underlying disagreement was so severe, but because neither person was willing to slow down long enough to actually understand what the other was communicating before reacting. Patient people approach conflict completely differently. They understand that the urge to resolve tension immediately is often exactly the wrong instinct, that some friction needs time and space to be properly understood before it can be genuinely resolved rather than just superficially smoothed over. This willingness to sit with unresolved tension without forcing a premature resolution just to escape the discomfort of it is one of the clearest expressions of relational patience there is. And it's precisely what separates relationships that grow stronger through conflict from relationships that accumulate unresolved resentment behind a series of rushed, incomplete resolutions. The deepest, most resilient relationships are almost always built by people who were willing to be patient, not just in the easy moments, but specifically in the difficult ones, trusting that working through friction slowly and honestly produces far more lasting connection than rushing past it ever could. This is perhaps the clearest proof that patience is not weakness. It is, in fact, one of the most demanding and valuable forms of care one person can offer another. This patience also plays a critical role in how people come to genuinely know one another over time, rather than simply forming a static first impression and treating it as a complete picture. Everyone changes. Everyone has different sides that reveal themselves in different circumstances. And understanding someone fully requires seeing them across enough varied situations, enough time, enough seasons of life to build an accurate rather than a partial view. People who rush relationships tend to build their understanding of the other person almost entirely from the earliest interactions. The version presented when everyone is naturally on their best behavior, and they're often startled or disappointed later when a fuller picture emerges. One that includes flaws, moods, and complexities the early stage simply didn't reveal. This isn't dishonesty on anyone's part. It's simply the natural limitation of early impressions. Patient people understand this instinctively. They hold their early impressions loosely, treating them as a starting point rather than a finished conclusion. And they remain genuinely curious about who someone is becoming over time, rather than assuming they already have the complete picture after only a few interactions. This patience allows for a kind of ongoing discovery that keeps relationships alive and evolving rather than static and increasingly disconnected from who the other person actually is. It also creates space for both people to grow and change, without that growth being treated as a betrayal of some fixed, early impression neither of them ever fully embodied in the first place. Real connection isn't built once and then maintained without effort. It's continuously rebuilt, patiently, through the willingness to keep learning about someone long after the initial excitement of getting to know them has settled into something quieter and, if given enough patience, something far more durable. This patience also determines how people handle the inevitable seasons where a relationship feels distant or strained without any single dramatic cause. Every long-term relationship moves through cycles. Periods of closeness, followed by periods of quiet distance. And impatient people often panic during these distant seasons, interpreting them as evidence that something is fundamentally broken and needs immediate fixing or ending. Patient people understand these seasons differently, as a natural rhythm rather than a crisis, trusting that closeness tends to return on its own timeline, as long as both people remain committed to the relationship rather than abandoning it the moment it stops feeling effortless. This trust doesn't mean tolerating genuine neglect or harm. Patience is never an excuse for accepting mistreatment, but it does mean distinguishing between a relationship moving through an ordinary quiet season and a relationship that has genuinely broken down. A distinction that requires exactly the kind of patient, honest reflection that impulsive reaction never allows for. The relationships that last longest are rarely the ones that never experience distance. They are the ones where both people were patient enough to move through that distance without panicking, trusting the underlying connection to hold, even when it wasn't loudly announcing itself in every single moment. There's a final aspect of relational patience worth addressing directly, and it concerns how people extend patience not just to others, but to themselves within the context of a relationship. Many people carry a harsh, impatient standard for their own growth as a partner, friend, or family member, expecting themselves to arrive at emotional maturity, communication skill, or conflict resolution ability instantly, and treating every mistake along the way as evidence of some deep personal failing. This impatience with yourself can be just as corrosive to a relationship as impatience with the other person, because it often produces defensive reactions, an unwillingness to acknowledge mistakes for fear of confirming the harsh internal judgment you're already carrying. Patient people extend the same grace to their own growth that they extend to the relationship itself, understanding that becoming a better partner or friend is also a gradual, non-linear process, full of setbacks and slow improvement rather than instant transformation. This self-patience isn't an excuse to avoid accountability. It's what actually makes genuine accountability possible, because it's far easier to honestly acknowledge a mistake when you're not simultaneously terrified of what that mistake supposedly proves about your worth as a person. Extending patience inward toward your own imperfect, developing capacity to love and connect well turns out to be just as essential as extending it outward toward the people you're building those connections with. Chapter 14. When patience becomes wisdom, there comes a point. For anyone who practices patience consistently enough, over a long enough period of time, where the skill stops feeling like something you're actively doing and starts feeling like something closer to how you naturally see the world. This transition from patience as a discipline to patience as wisdom is subtle but profound, and it's worth understanding exactly what changes when it happens. In the earlier stages, patience requires conscious effort. You notice the urge to rush, and you deliberately choose not to act on it. You notice the temptation to react impulsively, and you deliberately choose to pause instead. This is real, valuable work, but it still requires active resistance against instinct, a kind of internal friction between what you want to do and what you're choosing to do instead. Wisdom emerges when this friction begins to dissolve, when the patient response is no longer something you have to force yourself into, but simply becomes your natural, instinctive way of relating to uncertainty, difficulty, and time itself. At this stage, you're no longer fighting your impatience, because your impatience has genuinely diminished, replaced by a deeper, more automatic trust in process, timing, and the natural unfolding of things. This is why older, more experienced people often display a kind of calm that younger people frequently misinterpret as apathy or low energy. It isn't apathy. It's the visible result of having practiced patience so consistently, for so long, that the underlying anxiety which once made patience difficult has simply worn away, replaced by a settled confidence that most situations, given enough time, resolve themselves far better than panic ever could have resolved them. This transition also changes how a person relates to their own mistakes and setbacks. Someone still developing patience as a skill often experiences setbacks as evidence they need to try harder, push faster, force a resolution. Someone who has moved into patience as wisdom experiences the same setbacks completely differently, not as emergencies requiring immediate correction, but as simply one more data point within a much longer story that hasn't finished unfolding yet. This shift in perspective is enormously freeing because it removes the constant background pressure that impatience creates. The sense that every single moment must go right or the entire trajectory is jeopardized. Wise, patient people understand, at a level deeper than intellectual agreement, that trajectories are built from long averages, not individual moments, and that a single setback, however significant it feels in the moment, rarely determines the ultimate outcome of a well-built, patiently pursued path. This understanding doesn't happen overnight, and it can't be shortcut through information alone. It has to be built. The same way every form of patience discussed throughout this video has to be built, through repeated, direct experience of choosing patience over panic, again and again, until that choice stops requiring effort and simply becomes who you are. This is the final destination of everything patience makes possible. Not just better outcomes, not just stronger discipline, not just deeper relationships, but an entirely different, calmer, wiser relationship with time itself, one that very few people ever reach, precisely because very few people are willing to patiently do the work required to get there. One of the clearest signs that someone has crossed from disciplined patience into genuine wisdom is how they respond to other people's urgency. Someone still developing patience as a skill can often be pulled off course by other people's panic, absorbing their anxiety and reacting to it as though it were their own emergency. Someone who has moved into wisdom has developed a kind of quiet immunity to this contagion. They can be fully present with someone else's urgent distress, offering genuine support and attention without that urgency destabilizing their own steady internal state. This is an enormously valuable capacity, because it means they can remain a source of stability for others, precisely in the moment stability is needed most, rather than becoming just one more anxious voice adding to the chaos. This capacity is built the same way every form of patience discussed throughout this video gets built, through repetition, through choosing calm over contagion again and again, until that choice becomes automatic rather than effortful. And it's worth noting that this wisdom is not the same as detachment or indifference to other people's struggles. Wise, patient people often care more deeply than anyone else in the room, precisely because their steadiness allows them to stay present with difficulty without needing to escape it through premature reassurance or forced resolution. Their calm isn't distance, it's depth, the kind of depth that can only be built through years of patiently choosing to stay steady, again and again, until steadiness simply becomes who they are. It's also worth noting that this kind of wisdom rarely arrives through comfort. It's almost always forged through periods of genuine difficulty, patiently endured, rather than through years of ease. This is an uncomfortable truth, but an important one, because it means the hardest seasons of your life, the ones that feel the least like progress while you're inside them, are often exactly the seasons doing the most to build the wisdom that will eventually define how you move through everything that comes afterward. This doesn't mean you should seek out unnecessary hardship for its own sake. But it does mean reframing the hardship that inevitably arrives anyway, not as an unfortunate detour from your real path, but as one of the primary mechanisms through which the calmest, wisest version of yourself is actually being constructed. Every patient choice made during a genuinely difficult season carries more weight than the same choice made during an easy one, precisely because it's being tested against real resistance rather than none at all. This is why the wisest people you'll ever meet rarely describe their wisdom as something that arrived easily. They describe it as something built slowly, patiently, often painfully, across exactly the kind of difficult seasons most people spend their whole lives trying to avoid. This is ultimately why wisdom cannot be taught in the way information can. You can hear every idea in this video, understand each one intellectually, and still not possess the wisdom being described. Because wisdom isn't knowledge about patience. It's the lived, embodied result of having practiced patience through enough real difficulty that it has become woven into how you actually respond to life, rather than simply how you think about it. This is, in many ways, freeing rather than discouraging. It means you don't need to worry about whether you've absorbed enough concepts or understood enough theory. You simply need to keep choosing patience in the actual difficult moments of your actual life, trusting that the wisdom will accumulate on its own, quietly, the same way every other form of patience discussed throughout this video accumulates, through repetition rather than through understanding alone. Chapter 15. Becoming the strongest person in the room. Everything explored throughout this video points toward a single, unavoidable conclusion. The strongest person in any room is rarely the loudest, the fastest, or the most visibly aggressive. It's the person who has learned to hold steady while everyone else reacts. The person whose decisions are shaped by patient strategy rather than impulsive urgency. The person who trusts a timeline others have long since abandoned. This kind of strength doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. It shows up in the quality of decisions made under pressure, in the depth of relationships built over years rather than days, in the quiet confidence of someone who has repeatedly proven to themselves that they can endure difficulty without collapsing, in the discipline to keep building long after the excitement has faded and the results still haven't arrived. This is what real strength actually looks like. Not the dramatic, visible kind that gets celebrated in the moment, but the durable, compounding kind that quietly outperforms everyone chasing shortcuts, everyone rushing toward outcomes they aren't yet ready to sustain, everyone who mistook speed for progress and urgency for strategy. You now understand why the people around you, the ones constantly starting over, constantly comparing themselves to others, constantly abandoning good decisions the moment they become uncomfortable, are often working harder than you while achieving far less. Not because they lack ability, but because they've never learned to trust the slow, unglamorous middle where real transformation actually happens. Think back over everything covered so far and notice how each idea builds directly on the one before it. Speed creates the illusion of progress, while patience produces the reality of it. Impatience keeps people cycling through the same exhausting restarts, while patience allows for steady, uninterrupted forward motion. Restraint gives you control over your own reactions, instead of surrendering that control to whoever happens to provoke you. Compounding rewards those willing to stay invisible long enough for their effort to finally become undeniable. Discipline, sustained patiently, eventually stops requiring effort and becomes identity. The myth of overnight success collapses the moment you understand that every visible achievement was built on years of invisible work. Emotional mastery under pressure comes not from suppressing your reactions, but from creating enough space for your wisest self to respond, instead of your most frightened self reacting. The long-game advantage rewards anyone willing to think further ahead than everyone else competing for the same outcome. Confidence, built patiently through accumulated evidence, rather than borrowed from external praise, becomes unshakable precisely because it was never dependent on anyone else's opinion. Refusing to chase someone else's timeline frees you to build at the pace your own path actually requires. The patience of masters teaches you to trust the plateau instead of fearing it. The strength in not explaining yourself protects your energy from being drained by doubt that argument was never going to resolve anyway. Patience, as the foundation of real connection, builds relationships strong enough to survive the friction that inevitably arrives in anything worth keeping. And wisdom, the final destination of all of this, transforms patience from something you have to practice into something you simply are. Every one of these ideas points toward the same underlying truth: that the version of you capable of holding steady, thinking clearly, and building patiently through difficulty is not some distant, idealized future self. It is a version of you that gets built one patient choice at a time. Starting the very next moment, you're tempted to rush, react, or give up, and choose, instead, to wait. What you do with this understanding now is entirely up to you. You can go back to chasing the same urgency everyone around you is trapped in, forcing outcomes before they're ready, abandoning strategies the moment they fail to produce instant results, measuring your progress against timelines that were never actually yours to follow. Or you can choose differently. You can choose to trust the plateau instead of fearing it. You can choose restraint instead of impulsive reaction. You can choose to let your results speak instead of constantly explaining and defending every decision to people whose doubt was never going to be resolved through argument anyway. You can choose to build relationships patiently, to face pressure with practiced calm, to measure your worth not by how fast you're moving but by how consistently you're showing up day after day for a version of success that hasn't arrived yet but is being quietly built with every patient choice you make. Picture for a moment the version of yourself 1 year from today, having applied everything covered in this video consistently, patiently, without demanding instant proof that it was working along the way. That version of you has weathered the plateau instead of quitting during it. That version of you has practiced restraint enough times that composure under pressure now feels more natural than panic. That version of you has stopped needing to explain every decision to every skeptic, redirecting that energy into work solid enough to make the explanations unnecessary. That version of you has built relationships strong enough to survive real friction because you were patient enough to work through it instead of running from it. That version of you carries a kind of confidence that isn't loud or performative because it was built through quiet, repeated evidence rather than borrowed from anyone else's approval. None of this requires you to be smarter, more talented, or more naturally gifted than anyone around you. It only requires you to be more patient than they're willing to be, to stay in the room, in the process, in the discomfort, a little longer than everyone else is willing to stay. That is the entire secret hiding behind every quiet, lasting achievement you've ever admired. Not some rare gift reserved for a fortunate few, but a decision available to you starting right now, to trust time instead of fighting it, to build instead of rush, and to become patiently, deliberately, and unmistakably stronger than everyone still chasing shortcuts that were never actually there. This is not an easy path. It was never going to be easy, because if it were easy, everyone would already be walking it, and the advantage patience creates would disappear entirely. But that difficulty is exactly what makes it so powerful. Every time you choose patience while everyone else chooses urgency, you widen the gap between where you're headed and where they're stuck, cycling through the same impatient patterns that keep pulling them back to the beginning. The power of patience was never about waiting passively for good things to happen. It was always about becoming the kind of person who can hold steady, build steadily, and grow steadily, long after everyone else has given up and gone searching for a faster way that was never actually there. That is what makes you stronger than everyone around you. Not speed, not urgency, not the appearance of progress, just the quiet, compounding, unshakable strength of someone who finally learned how to wait.